Welcome back, casual gardeners. Spring is fast approaching in the northern hemisphere, and if you're like me, you've got an itch. You need to get out here and plant stuff. And you might have a big list of things you want to plant, which, is exciting, but also it's kind of a daunting task to keep track of when everything should be planted inside and transplanted out, or when to direct sow things. So that's pretty much what this video is about. The goal is to share with you most of the more common planting times relative to a last frost date for the more popular stuff that belongs in a garden. When you plant things is going to be a function of where you live. Now, there are too many possible crops for me to cover them all in this video, so I'm just hitting some high points, if you will. Always feel free to mention, additional things you'd like to learn about in the comments, and I will probably respond to your comment with an answer to your specific question. And if I get enough questions, I might make a comment response video. Before we really get into it, it's probably a good idea to talk about what a last frost date actually is and how to find out what your last frost date is. If you're curious, my last frost date is May 6th. Here in Logan, Utah. When I lived in the Salt Lake Valley in West Valley, Utah, my last frost date was April 16th. So that's only an hour and a half away, but it's quite a difference. I have included at least one link in the description of this video that you can use to find out what your last frost date is. And I like to go with the websites that you enter your zip code and it tells you your last frost date rather than the maps, because sometimes it's really hard to tell from a map when your last frost date is supposed to be. Logan, Utah and Salt Lake City, Utah are really close together on a map, but we have wildly different last frost dates. Once you've found your last frost date, what is it? Your last frost date is the average time, the average date, not time of day, that you've gotten your last light frost of the season in the past. A light freeze is going to be temperatures between 29 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about between negative 2 degrees Celsius and 0 degrees Celsius. So that's just below freezing. A light freeze is going to kill or damage tender crops, but it's not going to harm frost-tolerant crops. So some examples of crops that can handle a light frost would be kale and peas. Because your last frost date is an average of things that have happened in the past, there is never a guarantee that you won't get a frost after your last frost date. And you could even get a hard frost after your last frost date. A hard frost is anytime the temperatures drop below about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, below negative 2 degrees Celsius. Hard frosts are going to kill or damage most unprotected foliage in your garden. Some vegetables, some annual vegetables, can be direct sown as soon as the soil is workable. So that would be things like peas or kale. And the time before your last frost that your soil becomes workable is really going to be a function of the climate where you live. It's going to be anywhere from 60 days to 30 days before your last frost. So here I have a relatively cold climate and we're up in a mountain valley. So my soil is, it's still frozen right now. I wouldn't even plant peas yet. You can also choose to start a lot of these cold hardy vegetables indoors or in a cold frame or in a greenhouse. I like to direct sow my really frost hardy vegetables because it saves valuable real estate in my greenhouse and in my seed germination area in my house. But if you're one of those people who schedules things meticulously, you may find that you're able to plant out your frost hardy crops before it's even time to start your more tender crops indoors. These really frost hardy plants include broccoli, cabbage, spinach, and onions. But I'm going to put up a whole list somewhere. You'll see it. You see it right now. And these can just go right in the ground as soon as it's workable. Semi-hardy plants can be direct sown somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks before your last frost in most areas. These are the plants that can survive a light freeze, so that's temperatures 28 degrees Fahrenheit 2 degrees Celsius, negative 2 degrees Celsius or above, but they're going to get knocked down by a heavy frost. So these plants are going to include carrots, beets, and lettuce. Some crops are tender enough that they can't handle any freezing temperatures at all, but they can handle cooler temperatures earlier in their growth. So these are things that you would be planting on or after your last frost date, when things are still relatively cool, but they're warming up a bit. So some examples of these, there are some corn varieties, some bean varieties, cucumbers and celery, and I think potatoes can all go in on or after your last frost date. Even though they are warmer weather crops, they can tolerate that early cool early in their life. But make sure you check with the beans and the corn, because a lot of bean and corn varieties are not like that, and you will be very, very sad if you just assume they're all the same. And if you are planting staggered plantings of the more frost-hardy vegetables, so that would be, planting every 2 weeks so that you have continuous harvest, all of those can be planted wherever you are up until the last frost. And if you're in a cool enough climate, maybe a little bit afterwards, but things get a little dicey then. Some plants need warmer temperatures to germinate, or may become susceptible to cold or disease in temperatures even above freezing. Squash, some beans, peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants are all examples of these tender plants. Very tender crops should be planted no sooner than 1 week after your average last frost. And these are your best candidates for starting indoors and transplanting out if you want to get an early start on your growing season. When you start your very tender crops indoors is really going to depend on the vegetable and how early you need to start your crop to extend your season. A good example from my garden would be loofah gourds. Loofah gourds have a time to harvest, so that's when you start pulling off your first dry gourds, of about 200 days. But I have a growing season that is about 150 days long. So if I were to direct sow my loofah gourd, I'd be able to eat some young gourds off the plant, because if you harvest them when they're small and tender, you can actually eat them. But I would never ever get usable loofahs off my loofah gourd. So if I were to want to grow loofah gourds, and I probably will sometime in the future because they're just a lot of fun, I would need to start my loofah gourds indoors a full 2 or 3 months before my last frost, and I wouldn't be able to plant them out until probably late May, early April, when the soil was warm enough to support them. So I would have very tall, viney plants in my house or my greenhouse for a while if I tried to grow loofah gourds here. So if I wanted to grow loofah gourds in my 150-day growing season, it's not impossible, but I would need to start my seeds in a very large pot, at least 8 inches in diameter. I would want to probably count on fertilizing those seedlings before I transplanted them out. I'd want to provide a respectable trellis for my vine to climb, and probably as I got closer to time to transplant them out, I'd need to start moving them in and out of my house so that they can get adequate light without withering in the cold at night. Tomatoes need soil temperatures of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 10 degrees Celsius, before we can consider transplanting them out. Lower soil temperatures are going to set your plant back or might even make them sick. So for my climate, that means I have to wait until May before I can plant out any tomatoes. Because low soil temperatures can harm young tomatoes when we transplant them out, if you're super eager to do that, you might want to invest in a soil thermometer so you can just get them out there as soon as possible. How early you start your tomatoes is really going to depend on how much light and space you can provide for your young plants. Most people in most situations can support their tomatoes for about a month before it's time to transplant out. So that's a good general rule. If you have extra tall, well-lit space with lots of room in it, of course you can start your tomatoes a little bit earlier. Under ideal conditions, a tomato plant's a perennial. So if you had a heated greenhouse, you'd start your next year's tomatoes the previous year if you wanted to. Now, if you want your tomatoes to be about a month old when you transplant them out, account for at least 5 to 10 days germination time under optimal conditions. So that's with a heat mat. If you're growing your tomatoes without a heat mat, you're going to have really erratic germination times, possibly as long as 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. So no heat mat, start them a month early. Now, tomatoes are a very tender plant that can yield in as few as 75 to 90 days. So that means that theoretically, even in my climate, I could direct sow tomatoes once the soil was warm enough for germination. So if you are pressed for space inside, maybe you've got like a very small gardening space and you really just want to get some tomatoes, but you don't have any space indoors to start your tomatoes, as long as your time from 50 degrees soil to your last frost is more than 3 months, then you can actually just plant them directly outside. You're not going to have a really long harvest, but you'll get something. And in that situation, I would recommend going with determinate tomatoes. Those are tomatoes that put all of their energy into growth, and then when they reach a certain size, they just put all of their energy into fruiting, and they fruit all at once. So if I were to direct sow tomatoes here, well, out in my garden, not here, this is a greenhouse, I could probably start them a lot earlier, but if I were to direct sow tomatoes in my garden, I might get about a month of harvest before my plants died. Some plants, mostly the ones with tap roots, are best direct sown and should be direct sown as soon as the soil temperature reaches something that's appropriate for germination, depending on your plant. So if you're growing most varieties of corn or beans, you're going to want to wait for your soil temperature to reach about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 10 degrees Celsius, just like with tomatoes. Cooler temperatures are going to delay germination, and while that corn or bean is sitting in the ground waiting for stuff to warm up, they're going to be susceptible to rot, or if you have squirrels or birds in your neighborhood, they might just get eaten before they can even grow. So that minimum soil temperature is important for direct sowing. Now, some corn and bean varieties can be sown early, so check your packet. They know what they're talking about. Sometimes it's possible to transplant corn, but it's hard, because if you wait too long, you're going to do some damage to your corn roots, and those roots are important. Transplanted corn, even if you're really, really careful, is going to be more susceptible to lodging, which is just a fancy farmer word for falling over in the wind. And if you really want to transplant out some beans, your best bet is runner beans, like scarlet runner beans. The bush beans, you're going to want to direct sow those. Those yield early enough that there's no reason not to direct sow them. Carrots and parsnips are examples of hardier plants that should be direct sown. Sunflowers, I hear, are best direct sown, but I have had limited success starting them indoors because, well, if I'm not making a video, sometimes I might just start growing something without doing any research and try my luck and sometimes learn new stuff. So I did that with sunflowers. They are best to start outside, but you'll have limited success if you start inside and transplant sunflowers out. And keep in mind that any plant can be direct sown as long as the conditions are correct for germination when you do it. There are a lot of plants that folks say should not be transplanted that actually do pretty well once you try it. For example, I've had really great success with beets. Folks say beets are a root vegetable. You should not transplant root vegetables, therefore you should not transplant beets. That is false. Another good example is peas. I don't know why people say you shouldn't transplant peas. They transplant really well. I mean, the only reason not to transplant peas is that you don't have to. Unless you have a really, really, really short spring, and then you just rock into your warm season. And then melons and squash, they don't transplant well once they're established, but you can start melons and squash indoors, and a lot of farmers do. And that's just to give them a head start on the season, either to get an earlier harvest or to get larger fruit before it's time to harvest. So it's a thing you can do. as long as you're careful not to disturb those roots too much. If you live in the United States, there is a very good chance that you have an agricultural college in your state, and if you do, the agricultural college is required to offer extension services. That's the whole reason for agricultural colleges. Extension services are when your college helps the community learn to do survival stuff. Like here in the Cache Valley, Utah State University, they originally started off by helping farmers learn how to be better farmers. They provided sewing classes for the public. Today, the Utah State University Agricultural Extension actually offers gardening classes. And there's an extension office that we can call into and ask gardening questions. The Master Gardener program that I'm participating in is a program that came about because the horticultural specialists in the extensions were like, this is too much work. And so they had this idea, let's train civilians, let's train non-horticulturalists, people who are super keen on gardening, in the basics that we, the questions that they answer over and over again. Let's train some master gardeners and send them out to do volunteer work for us. So that's what I'm taking classes to do right now. There's probably one near you, and agricultural extension offices are the very best place to go to get gardening advice that is specific for your area. If you like this video, push that like button for me. Looking forward, my next video on 26th February is going to be part 1 of an electroculture experiment. So in that video, I'm going to go over, we'll talk briefly about what electroculture is, why I'm doing the experiment, how I'm setting up the experiment, and what a successful experiment would look like. The second part of the experiment I can't give a good date on because, well, it's up to the plants, really. They are growing here in the greenhouse. You saw me watering them earlier in the video. Maybe you noticed my little copper coil antennae, cute little things. But I'd like to collect at least 3 harvests before I generate any statistics and draw any conclusions and wrap up the experiment. So that's the very basics of when to plant. I hope that I was helpful. Thank you for joining me here in my garden, and I hope you have a wonderful time in your own.